You crack 2 eggs into a pan this morning without a single thought. The shells break clean, the yolks slide out. You toss the shells in the bin and never once consider what just happened. But stop for a second and actually look at what you're holding. An egg is a sealed biological capsule, a single cell designed to build an entire living animal from scratch, packed with every nutrient that animal will need to grow bones, feathers, organs, a beating heart. And you just cracked it open and scrambled it with some salt before your coffee was ready. Humans eat over 1.6 trillion eggs every single year. That is roughly 200 eggs per person on the planet, almost all of them from one species of bird that most people couldn't pick out of a lineup if it wasn't already plucked and wrapped in plastic. So how did we get here? When did a human being first look at an egg, something that was clearly becoming a bird, and decide to eat it instead? The answer goes back further than you'd expect. Much further. And it doesn't start with chickens at all. Let's start with what an egg actually is from a survival standpoint, because this is the part that explains everything that comes after. An egg is one of the most nutritionally complete foods that exists in nature. A single large chicken egg contains roughly 6 grams of protein, nearly all the amino acids your body needs, fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, iron, zinc, selenium, choline, and a fat profile that your brain can convert into energy almost immediately. It is, gram for gram, one of the most efficient calorie packages on the planet. And here's why that matters. If you're an ancient human, unlike meat, you don't have to chase it. Unlike fruit, it doesn't rot in 2 days. Unlike nuts, it doesn't require hours of cracking and sorting. An egg just sits there in a nest, unguarded, or at least poorly guarded, waiting for something to come along and take it. You didn't need a spear, you didn't need fire, you didn't need a trap or a coordinated group hunt. You just needed to find a nest, reach in, and take what was there. For a creature trying to survive in a landscape where every calorie burned matters, eggs were basically free energy. And we were not the first primates to figure this out. Not even close. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, raid bird nests regularly. Field researchers at Gombe, building on decades of work started by Jane Goodall, have documented chimps climbing trees to eat eggs and nestlings from bird nests as a routine part of their diet. Not frequently, not as a staple, but consistently enough that it's recognized as a normal chimpanzee behavior. Capuchin monkeys do it, baboons do it, rhesus macaques do it. Across the primate family tree, the pattern repeats. If a primate finds a nest with eggs in it, that primate eats those eggs. The behavior is old, the taste for it is old, the instinct is old, which means the very first hominins who walked upright in East Africa millions of years ago almost certainly did the same thing. We didn't invent egg eating, we inherited it. But here's the part most people never think about. When our ancestors came down from the trees and started walking upright on the African savanna, roughly 4 to 6 million years ago, something changed about their relationship with eggs. In the trees, a primate has access to bird nests built in branches. Small eggs, small birds, scattered canopy. On the ground, you have access to something different entirely. Ground nesting birds, and ground nesting birds in Africa during the Pliocene and Pleistocene were not small, they were enormous. Ostriches, marabou storks, secretary birds, bustards, guinea fowl, all of them nesting on the open savanna. All of them leaving their eggs in exposed or poorly defended positions on the ground. Walking upright didn't just change how we moved, it changed what we could eat. It opened up a category of food that our tree-dwelling ancestors rarely had access to. Large, ground-level calorie-dense eggs just sitting there. And our ancestors, already pre-wired by millions of years of tree-based nest raiding, walked right up to them. So the transition to bipedalism, the event that set the entire trajectory of human evolution in motion, also happened to give us access to bigger and better eggs. That is one of those details that sounds too convenient to be true, but the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. Now here's where the story shifts from instinct to something far more interesting. Because at some point, humans stopped just stumbling across nests and started seeking eggs out deliberately. And the evidence for that is written in shells. The oldest confirmed archaeological evidence of humans eating eggs comes from Africa. And the eggs in question did not come from chickens. They came from ostriches. An ostrich egg weighs roughly 1.4 kilograms. That is the equivalent of about 24 chicken eggs in a single shell. A shell so thick you could stand on it without cracking it. Getting into one of those eggs required real effort. A stone tool, a deliberate blow, a plan. This was not an accident. This was a decision. At archaeological sites across southern and eastern Africa, ostrich eggshell fragments show up in human middens, the ancient refuse heaps where people discarded the remains of their meals. These fragments have been found at sites dating back over 100,000 years. And at some locations as far back as the Middle Stone Age, roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. The shells are broken in patterns consistent with deliberate cracking. Not natural fragmentation, not animal trampling, but the specific kind of breakage you get when a person hits a thick shell with a rock to open it. Picture what this actually looked like. A small group of humans, maybe 4 or 5 of them, walking across the dry scrubland of what is now South Africa. One of them spots a nest, maybe half a dozen ostrich eggs sitting in a shallow depression in the ground. The adult ostrich is gone, grazing somewhere out of sight. They move fast, they pick up the eggs, each one almost too big to hold in one hand, and carry them back to camp. Someone takes a smooth stone and strikes the top of the shell hard enough to puncture it, but careful enough not to shatter the whole thing. The contents pour out, raw, thick, protein-rich, enough food in a single egg to feed 2 or 3 people, and when they're done, the shell is still intact. Tough, waterproof, roughly the size of a small melon. They don't throw it away, they keep it. Think about that for a second. 250,000 years before the first city was built, before the first farm was planted, before anyone had any concept of agriculture or domestication, people were already eating eggs, regularly enough that the discarded shells pile up in their garbage heaps, but the egg wasn't just food. And this is where the story starts to get genuinely strange. Because our ancestors looked at that empty ostrich eggshell after they'd eaten what was inside and thought, I can use this for something else. At Diepkloof Rock Shelter in the Western Cape of South Africa, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of ostrich eggshell fragments dating to approximately 60,000 years ago. These shells had been deliberately punctured, given an opening at the top, and used as water containers. Canteens. In a dry, arid landscape where the nearest water source might be a day's walk away, an empty ostrich eggshell, sturdy, waterproof, lightweight enough to carry, was technology. It was the difference between being able to cross a stretch of open desert and dying of thirst before you reached the other side. And that's still not the strangest part. Those same eggshells at Diepkloof were engraved, covered in standardized geometric patterns, hatched lines, cross-hatching, repeated motifs that appear across multiple shells in consistent styles. Researchers interpret these as one of the oldest known graphic traditions in human history, possibly markers of individual identity or group belonging. Someone sat down with a sharp tool and carved patterns into an empty eggshell 60,000 years ago. Not for food, not for survival, but for meaning. The egg gave them calories, the shell gave them water storage, and then it gave them art. That is 3 uses from a single object found sitting in a nest. Now, the ostrich egg story tells us about Africa. But what about the rest of the world? Because as humans spread across the planet, they encountered very different birds and very different eggs. And the relationship between humans and eggs gets wilder the further you travel. Jump to Australia, roughly 50,000 years ago. Early humans arrive on a continent that is home to a bird called Genyornis newtoni, a giant flightless bird standing over 2 meters tall, weighing somewhere around 220 to 240 kilograms. Think of a cassowary, then double it. This bird could not fly, it could not hide, it could not build a nest high enough to be safe from anything with hands, and it laid eggs that weighed roughly 1.5 kilograms each. Massive, protein-rich, sitting in ground nests with absolutely nothing stopping a determined human from walking up and taking them. Now, think about this from the perspective of the first humans to cross into Australia. You've just arrived on a continent where nothing has ever seen a human being before. The animals have no fear of you. The birds don't run when you approach. The nests are everywhere, completely undefended, filled with eggs larger than anything you've ever encountered. You would eat them. Of course you would eat them. That is not even a decision. That is just what happens when an omnivore with 200,000 years of egg-eating experience encounters an all-you-can-eat buffet with no cover charge. Researchers from the University of Cambridge, led by a team using paleoproteomics, confirmed in a 2024 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that burned eggshell fragments found at over 200 sites across Australia belonged to Genyornis. The burn patterns on these shells are diagnostic. Parts of each shell are heavily blackened while adjacent sections are barely scorched, a pattern consistent with an egg being placed in the embers of a small localized fire. Not a wildfire, which would burn everything uniformly. A campfire. Someone was cooking these eggs, and based on the dating of these fragments 50,000 to 55,000 years ago, they were doing it almost from the moment humans first arrived on the continent. Here's the part that should stop you. There is virtually no evidence of butchery marks on Genyornis bones, no spear points lodged in its skeleton, almost nothing to suggest that humans were hunting the adult birds at all. What the evidence does suggest is that humans were targeting the eggs, raiding nests, taking every egg they could find, season after season, generation after generation. And over thousands of years of systematic nest raiding, the reproductive rate of Genyornis collapsed. The birds couldn't replace themselves fast enough. By roughly 47,000 years ago, Genyornis was extinct. Humans may have eaten an entire species of giant bird into oblivion, not by hunting it, but by eating its eggs. The breakfast that killed a species, that is a sentence that shouldn't be real, but it is. So for most of human history, the egg story is about finding wild eggs, eating them, and moving on. It was opportunistic. Seasonal, unpredictable, you ate eggs when you found them. You went without when you didn't. There was no reliable supply, there was no breakfast routine. There was just luck and timing, and a willingness to put your hand into a nest that might belong to something with talons. And then everything changed because someone in Southeast Asia made a friend. The chicken, the animal that now provides roughly 92% of all eggs consumed on Earth, descends from the red jungle fowl, a small, colorful bird native to the forests of Southeast Asia. In the wild, a red jungle fowl hen lays roughly 10 to 15 eggs per year, not per month, per year. One small clutch, laid seasonally, incubated carefully, and then the hen goes broody and stops laying entirely. This is a wild bird that produces eggs at roughly 3% of the rate a modern laying hen does. Nobody was building a breakfast economy around 12 eggs a year. For a long time, researchers assumed chickens were domesticated early, maybe 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. But recent archaeological work, particularly a comprehensive study from the University of Oxford published in 2022, pushed the timeline forward dramatically. Unambiguous evidence of chicken domestication doesn't appear until roughly 1500 BCE, and the initial reason humans kept these birds around was probably not eggs at all. Early evidence suggests chickens were valued for cockfighting, for ritual sacrifice, and as exotic curiosities. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they all kept chickens, but for centuries these birds sat closer to the ceremonial end of the spectrum than the kitchen. They were pets and performers before they were breakfast. The turning point came somewhere along the Silk Road. In 2024, researchers Robert Spengler and Carly Peters at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology published a study in Nature Communications analyzing eggshell fragments from 12 archaeological sites across Central Asia. Using a technique called ZooMs, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, they identified the protein signatures in tens of thousands of tiny shell fragments and confirmed that these were chicken eggs. The abundance of these fragments at sites dating to approximately 400 BCE tells a specific story. These chickens were not just being kept, they were being kept for their eggs. This is the earliest clear evidence that chickens had begun losing their natural seasonal laying pattern. Something had shifted in their biology. Whether through deliberate human selection or the unintentional pressures of captivity and feeding, these birds were starting to lay more eggs more frequently outside their natural breeding season. That shift is the hinge point of the entire modern egg industry, because a chicken that lays 12 eggs a year is a curiosity. A chicken that lays 100 eggs a year is useful. A chicken that lays 300 eggs a year is an industry. And that transformation happened not through any single breakthrough, but through thousands of years of slow, relentless selective pressure. Every farmer who kept the hen that laid more eggs and ate the one that didn't was without knowing it, running a genetics experiment. The broody instinct got bred out, the laying season extended, the clutch size increased. By the time modern industrial breeding programs got involved in the 20th century, the chicken's reproductive system had already been reshaped beyond anything its wild ancestor would recognize. Now, while the chicken was being slowly engineered into an egg machine along the Silk Road, something genuinely remarkable was happening in Egypt. And it had nothing to do with selective breeding. The Egyptians solved a completely different problem. They figured out how to hatch eggs without a hen. Ancient Egyptian egg ovens, called mamals, were large mud brick structures, multi-chambered buildings that could hold tens of thousands of eggs at a time. Workers lit fires in upper chambers, generating radiant heat that filtered down to lower rooms where the eggs were arranged on beds of straw and flax. These workers controlled temperature by adjusting fires, opening and closing vents, and spreading damp jute over the eggs to regulate humidity. They gauged the internal temperature by pressing an egg against their eyelid, which is sensitive enough to detect differences of a fraction of a degree. No thermometers, no electricity, no digital sensors, just a person's eyelid against a warm shell. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE and was so astonished by these hatcheries that he wrote, "They produced poultry in numbers beyond telling through methods that seemed almost magical." Centuries later, the French naturalist René-Antoine Ferchot de Réaumer studied them and declared, in a line that deserves to be remembered, Egypt ought to be prouder of them than her pyramids. The technology was so effective and so closely guarded that it was passed down through families for generations, essentially a trade secret older than most countries currently on the map. And some of these traditional hatcheries kept operating, essentially unchanged into the 20th century. Think about what that represents for a moment. No written manual, no patent, no university, just families passing down the exact knowledge of how hot a fire needs to be, how often to turn the eggs, how much moisture to add, from parent to child for over 2,000 years. That is how important eggs were to Egyptian civilization. Important enough to build purpose-built industrial hatcheries and guard the technology like a state secret. Meanwhile, in Rome, eggs were so embedded in daily life that they literally became a figure of speech. A Roman meal traditionally began with eggs and ended with fruit, giving rise to the expression abovo usque ad mala, from the egg to the apples, meaning from start to finish. The phrase survived long after the meal tradition faded. Romans also had a superstitious habit of crushing eggshells on their plates after eating to prevent evil spirits from hiding inside the empty shells, which is either deeply endearing or deeply strange, depending on how seriously you take the idea of a demon the size of a marble choosing an eggshell as its living quarters. By the medieval period in Europe, eggs were everywhere. Christianity actually accelerated the demand. Eggs were one of the foods permitted during certain fasting periods, which gave farmers a powerful economic incentive to keep laying hens. More fasting rules meant more eggs consumed, which meant more chickens kept, which meant more eggs available year-round. A dietary restriction designed to encourage spiritual discipline accidentally built a continent-wide poultry infrastructure. Religion shaped the egg industry as much as biology did, and eggs weren't universal. Different cultures drew different lines around which eggs you could eat and which you couldn't. Kosher dietary law permits only eggs from birds that are themselves kosher. And even then, if a blood spot appears in the yolk, the entire egg must be discarded, because Jewish law treats that spot as evidence the egg was developing toward life. Islamic dietary guidelines carry similar restrictions tied to which birds are permissible. In parts of Southeast Asia, the most popular way to eat an egg is balut, a fertilized duck egg incubated for 2 to 3 weeks, boiled and eaten with the partially formed embryo still inside. Millions of people eat it regularly. To someone raised on a carton of white, grade-A chicken eggs from a supermarket, that concept triggers genuine revulsion. But structurally, it is the same food, same shell, same nutrients, same biology, just consumed at a different stage. Psychologist Paul Rosen, who spent decades studying disgust responses at the University of Pennsylvania, found that this reaction has almost nothing to do with safety. It is learned. A child raised eating balut feels nothing. A child raised on scrambled eggs recoils. Nobody is born disgusted by a fertilized egg. That response gets installed later, and once it is in place, it almost never comes out. And then came the Industrial Revolution, and within roughly a century and a half, everything about the human relationship with eggs changed one final time. Battery cages were introduced in the 1930s and widely adopted by the 1950s. By the mid-20th century, a single facility could house hundreds of thousands of hens in rows of wire cages, each cage holding 6 to 10 birds in a space roughly the size of a filing cabinet drawer. Feeding was automated, egg collection was automated. The hens themselves were treated as production units. Their natural behaviors, nesting, perching, dust bathing, scratching, eliminated by a system designed to maximize output per square meter. The result is the number you already heard, 1.6 trillion eggs per year globally, from a bird that in the wild would lay 12. The red jungle fowl that scratched around in the forests of Southeast Asia, laying a single clutch a year in a hidden ground nest, was transformed into an animal that produces 300 eggs a year under fluorescent lighting in a wire enclosure, often never touching the ground its entire life. The egg didn't change, the bird was changed around it, and then in one of the stranger chapters of the entire story, modern science almost killed the egg a second time. In 1968, the American Heart Association issued dietary guidelines recommending that Americans consume no more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day and no more than 3 whole eggs per week. A single large egg contains roughly 186 milligrams of cholesterol, mostly in the yolk. The message was clear. Eggs were dangerous. Eggs clogged your arteries. Eggs would, if eaten with the enthusiasm your body was clearly asking for, kill you. And for the next 4 decades, that warning shaped how an entire civilization ate its breakfast. Egg white omelets became a health food. The yolk became a villain. Egg consumption in the United States dropped steadily from the 1960s through the early 2000s, falling from roughly 400 eggs per person per year to under 250. The problem was that the science behind the warning was, as it turned out, substantially wrong. Large-scale reviews, including a major meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2013, found no significant association between moderate egg consumption and increased risk of heart disease or stroke in otherwise healthy adults. The dietary cholesterol in eggs, it turned out, has a relatively small effect on blood cholesterol levels for most people. Your liver makes its own cholesterol regardless of what you eat, and in most cases it adjusts production downward when dietary intake goes up. In 2015, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in the United States quietly removed the daily cholesterol cap from its recommendations, acknowledging that dietary cholesterol was not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. The egg had been found not guilty after a 47-year trial, but the damage was done. An entire generation grew up afraid of a food that humans had been eating without incident for 200,000 years. And you're standing at the end of that chain this morning, holding 2 shells over a frying pan. The same basic food that a hominin in East Africa pulled from an ostrich nest 200,000 years ago. The same calorie package that sustained humans crossing Australian deserts 50,000 years ago. The same protein source that the Egyptians hatched by the tens of thousands in mud brick ovens using their eyelids as thermometers. The same ingredient the Romans started every dinner with and the medieval church accidentally turned into a continent-wide industry. One egg, 200,000 years of history. You cracked it in about half a second. Tomorrow morning, when you do it again, you might remember that the first person who ever did it had to hit an ostrich egg with a rock, sitting on the ground somewhere in Africa, with no pan, no stove, no salt, and absolutely no idea what they were starting. And you might decide that your version with the stove and the spatula and the coffee machine humming in the background is on balance a pretty good deal, no complaints.